Hello, this is Digital Accessibility, the people behind the progress. I'm Joe Walensky, the creator and host of this series. And as an accessibility professional myself, I find it very interesting as to how others have found their way into this profession. So let's meet one of those people right now and hear about their journey. All right, well, here we go with another episode where I have the great opportunity to talk with another accessibility practitioner. And today I am speaking with Gareth Ford Williams. Hello, Gareth. How are you today?
Hi, Joe. I'm good. How are yourself? You good?
Yeah, it's all good. In my home office on Vashon Island, which is near Blink's Seattle headquarters. Where are you talking to us from?
I'm from a small town just north of Manchester in the north of England called Ramsbottom. Lots of people have heard of it, and no one really knows where it is. But yeah, so we're up in the hills in the north of England.
All right. Well, I've been to Manchester, but I haven't been out to your village yet. But maybe sometime in the future. But yeah, it's great to have you on here. And a good place to always start is if you could chat a little bit about what you're currently involved with for your work.
After a long stint at the BBC, I left just about 18 months ago, nearly 2 years. It's getting on to that sort of length of time now, and I left to do a couple of things, and I always like to have more than one project going on. And so I'm working with a group of people from ex-Google and ex-BBCers who also have an interest in inclusive design data. One of the things that I think we've always been lacking in is good quantitative data. And so that was something that I never really got the chance to do in my job. It was something that I've always been kind of very heavily sort of data driven in a lot of decision making areas, and it was something that was missing. And so I thought, well, nice to do a project, and the project has kind of turned into something much bigger now, which is great. And it's called Ably. It's ab11y.com, so that's nice. And at the same time, I'm also working as a consultant for a couple of companies as well in the UK. One of them, very, very big company that's doing a huge piece of digital transformation, and they said this is a huge opportunity, and they've got literally hundreds of websites, and they said we need to move the whole thing into new platforms. We need to change everything. This is the perfect moment to build accessibility in a very meaningful and robust way. How do we do that? And so, yeah, we're right in the middle of that. It's a huge project, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it.
Well, as someone who's involved in consultancy, what is it like for you, kind of on a day in the life or a week in the life? I'm sure it changes around on projects, but are there, any certain angles or themes that tend to make up most of your work?
I'm not. I'm not a massive fan of auditing. I think auditing is something that I always try to avoid. If anything else, I think if you can build inclusive things rather than sort of design and build inclusion in from the start, and build it right the way through your processes, and make sure that the conversation happens right the way through product development and service development, then there's no, you don't need to audit and do stuff. There's a lot of behaviors in organizations where they try and build things and then make them accessible, and always at the BBC we used to have sort of certain mantras around things, and we used to say we're not going to design things that disable people, and we used to have a very kind of social model perspective of that. And because when something's a concept, when something's just an idea, and we've got this idea for a new service or a new product, everyone can access that because it's just an idea. And accessibility is a proactive thing if it's not checked. So every design decision you make, every technical decision you make, it can impact on someone if you don't sit and think about, how does this impact on, sort of create barriers or exclusion around it. And so, we used to we used to do all sorts of, neat little bits and pieces. Sometimes we used to have some, I used to find them funny, workshops where we would actually own exclusion. If we're going to exclude, let's be honest about it right up front. We used to actually call it "Who are we willing to exclude," and we used to make a list. And it sounds odd, and it sounds like a sort of counterintuitive thing to do, but sometimes exclusion, if it's planned for, is kind of meaningful. So one of the things we would do is say, if it was a news application for the BBC News, we would ask questions like, are we building this for anyone who's under 5 years old? And people would say, no, of course we're not. And we're like, well, it's fine. We're willing to exclude them. We're not going to actively exclude them, but we're not going to design for them. And then we would start exploring more and more and more people. Are we building this for someone who's not got a mobile phone? No, they're on there. And you can, or outside of the UK, it's geo-locked and it's fine. And we would end up with a huge list. And we were saying it's okay for all of these scenarios. We're not going to actively exclude them, but they're not within, they're not a focus for us as far as design is concerned. And now we're going to make a list of all of the people who aren't on that first list. Who are we talking about? Who gets a designed experience? Who are we going to think about right at the beginning? And we're going to try and avoid designing and building barriers in for people, and just understand that human beings are complicated things. We're all complicated. We all have needs. We all have preferences, and we think about those from the outset. And that was kind of always the way that we tried to do stuff. And so the need for auditing is massively reduced. And you're not thinking about it, although the outcome would be compliance, because compliance has some very sensible things about it in it, but it's not an answer. And you're thinking about designed experiences, and that's how you get sort of comparative and inclusive design. Yeah, we used to do all sorts of extra bits and pieces. So I'm kind of going off on a side shoot here, but one of the teams that I used to manage was the assistive technology team at the BBC. I had a couple of teams in my portfolio, so accessibility, and I'll talk about some of that side in a bit. But we used to look at sort of internal systems in the organisation, and your baseline is sort of is standards and guidelines and stuff, and you just think, yeah, you just do those. It's like whether sort of you're buying furniture, you want to make sure that someone has tested it to make sure that it isn't going to catch fire, and you have stickers and stuff on it. It says, yeah, there's certain standards this meets, etc. And you think the people we're buying from, if we're buying a system, they do that testing. We don't test their stuff. I don't go into IKEA and set fire to furniture to find out whether it will burn or not. IKEA would be very upset if I did. I don't need to prove to them whether their stuff is safe, and accessibility was the same. But what we would do is we would always think about it from a user experience point of view. So if it takes me 5 minutes to do a task on a system, and it takes someone else who's got different needs and uses different assistive technology, if it takes them 15 minutes to do the same thing, even if it's compliant, we would ask the question, where do they find the other 10 minutes? In their working day, and do they take fewer or shorter breaks, or do they work longer hours? What's the expectation? Are they supposed to be less productive, even though they're equally as competent as I am in their role? Why do they have to be designed out of opportunity? And then when you look at the hundreds of internal systems, how that suddenly becomes bigger and bigger in a exercise. But for me, it's always about experience and experience design first, and thinking of that in an inclusive way. I think I've gone off on a massive tangent there. I'm sorry about that, Jeff. I think it kind of explains a little bit about my ethos.
Yeah, no, that's great, and it sounds really progressive. And we have had others on here with experiences with the BBC, and it seems like an organization that was always thinking about this area in depth. We could talk more about the that experience, but I also like to kind of go back in time and help identify where in our live life or work life we first are aware of accessibility. It's different for everybody, and then kind of what often comes after that for us is how we and when we decide to make that part of our profession.
Yeah,
So, kind of
yeah.
when did it start with you, where you realized there was something going on here that you
I,
wanted to be involved with?
I'm going to turn the clock back to 1971, which shows my age. I was 2 years old. So at 2 years old, we moved to Manchester, where we lived, and my dad took on a job for managing, sort of headmaster of a school. And it was a school called Ewing School. It was in South Manchester. It was a residential school, so the kids lived there during the week. And they were very small children, sort of from aged 4 came in from the day. But I think I can't remember the age, but there was over a certain age they lived there for the week. It was they had dormitories and rooms and stuff, and all of the kids there. Ewing was really progressive school, and all of the kids there were aphasic, so they all had language disorder and communication disorders. We had kids there that were autistic, lots of different types of syndromes and complex needs and disorders and stuff. And that was my home. We lived there. We lived on site. We lived on a little flat above the school, and the stairs went through the school to and it's where I lived. It's where I played. They were my friends. I grew up there. It was I see it as an enormously privileged experience to grow up in an environment like that. And I mean, sadly, my dad passed away just before Christmas, and we've just had the funeral, and lots of those ex-pupils came, and I met all of these people, and we were like, we haven't seen each other since we were 11 or or 8 and things like that. And it's just absolutely wonderful meeting all of these people again. But it was a proper family. It was an extension of the family where we grew up, and there were 3 sign languages spoken there, and it was fantastic. And it had lots of connections with other schools as well. There was another one. There was Shawbrook. I always get Shawbrook and Shaw Grove mixed up, but there was one for culturally deaf and severely hearing impaired children. The other one was for blind children, which were nearby, and they used to do swaps and sort of all sorts of wonderful sort of collaborative work between these schools and between which was great for the time. And I think it was just one of those things. It was just part of my life, and I got involved in various different arts projects because I ended up as an art student. I wanted to be a painter, and and that was all great. And then finally one day I decided I need to get a proper job and get my hair cut, and and all the rest of it, and grow up a bit, and became a parent. Ended up working in advertising agencies and design agencies, and then joined the BBC. Eventually I went into marketing and joined the BBC as a brand manager, and had this wonderful title of brand manager North, and I looked after the north of England and the output that was there, and literally had a chance meeting with a chap who is called Tony Aggie, who runs digital now at New York Public Library. But at the time he was running bbc.co.uk, and we had a chat about this. It was just one of those things. There's like my youngest at the time, I think, was 6 years old. At the time, Zach Ford Williams, he's now an actor. So this was about 2004, if I'm right, in my head. So he was about 5 or 6. And I said, look, he's got quadriplegic cerebral palsy, and I said, look, you've got these actually some really good stuff for motor disabled children in this one website, CBeebies, which the BBC brand for the under 6s is CBeebies. There's a TV channel, and it's all programmed for the under 6s. And then you move into CBBC, which is for 6 to 12, and there was nothing. There was virtually nothing he could access, and he was making that progression. I was like, brilliant. I'm a brand manager. You've just built a relationship, a brand relationship with someone, and now you've just dropped him age 6. How is that? Where is the consistency? Where is the thought around how we do this? And we ended up having a chat about it, and he was like, no, we know it's a problem, just nobody's got a plan. And I was really surprised because the BBC's got this enormous history around inclusion, going back to the 1930s, where it helped establish a charity called Wireless is for the Blind, which was making literally wireless sets in the 1930s for people who were blind. and then it invented InVision signing in the 1950s with programming and News for the Deaf, and then children's programming called Vision On for culturally deaf children. It's purely because one of the TV directors' best friend was culturally deaf and he couldn't access television. So he just stood a signer next to the news presenter, and bingo, we had an access service invented. And they launched and invented closed caption subtitling for broadcast in the late 60s and early 70s, and launched the first broadcast access services in the late 1970s nationally for closed captioning, and then built the first audio description production systems in the 90s for broadcast, which it shared with lots of other broadcasters. And I was like, you've done all of this, and yet what's going on there? And I wasn't after a job, but they turned it into my problem. They were like, well, you seem to have an idea. And I was like, I'm yeah. And yeah, literally they kind of gave me that. They said, the board of directors ended up giving me permission to start a small team up. And I said, we've just got to start with people and start understanding what our audience needs are, and go and talk to people and find out what we need to do. Let's not treat this as an exercise in compliance. Let's treat this as an exercise in, sort of in quality as far as user experience for audiences is concerned. People are paying a license fee, which is the thing that funds the BBC in the UK, and they should expect the same amount of value as everyone else. And no one argued with that. There was never I never had to sell it in. And it was great. And we started with a little project. There was a thing that they were prototyping, and they just said, well, start with that clean slate in the corner. You can do whatever you like, discover stuff there. That'd be your petri dish for accessibility, and then we'll capture it in guidance and guidelines and practices and push it out to the rest of the organization. And that project became known as BBC iPlayer. And so it all started in the world's first VOD service, was accessible from launch. We did everything, engineered it all in, got all of the access services working from day one. And everything we learned, we just scaled and scaled and scaled, and started a champions network to make sure that accessibility is discussed in every sprint and every planning session, and it's never let go, and just built it up as cultural practice. And yeah, thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, always the biggest challenge was, scale for me. It's an enormous organization with, a massive audience internationally. I think internationally their audience is about 500 million users a week, and and I think only the Google homepage is bigger than the BBC in the UK, and it's roughly the same size as Facebook in its user base. And so iPlayer has 19-20 plus million users a week, and so that was always our biggest thing was scaling these things up. But it just sort of happened. It was one of those, I never set out to do this. It's just sort of stars aligned along the way, and I'm always up for going, well, that looks like an interesting path to go down, and that's how I chose what I've done over the years, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It's been challenging, but yeah, I've loved it. It's a hell of a career choice.
Well, yeah, I appreciate you sharing some of your personal stories there, and also it's great to get that Wikipedia level summary of what the BBC has been involved in
oh yeah
for 100 years.
I was standing on the shoulders of giants. I mean, this is the way I felt when I turned up and just said, this organization, cares. It doesn't need to, it doesn't need a business case for this. It just turns around and says, we inform, educate, and entertain everyone. And any organization that has all or everyone in its mission statement has to do accessibility, or it's caveating those words. It's saying accept them. And then when you point that out, you just say, so, you're saying all, but not them. And they were like, oh yeah, them. Then we're doing accessibility. You can't filter people out from the word all or words all or everyone, So yeah, it's just it's great.
Well, from being involved in accessibility for so long, you've probably seen a lot of several different cycles. You've probably seen certain ideas come up and fade away, new ideas come up and fade away. And so, do you have any thoughts, kind of looking back and seeing where we are today, of maybe areas where you think things have been very successful, or on the other side of it, areas that you wish things maybe had moved along faster, things that you kind of looking in the future that you think maybe are ones that we need to emphasize in our own practices moving forward?
I think there's a whole areas. I mean, this is the nice thing is we've come a long way and we've got a long way to go because we're constantly dealing with a moving problem. And this is the thing I find fascinating about it. Technology is progressing and what we understand about people is progressing continuously. People are wonderfully complicated, which makes design interesting. If we were all the same, it would be so boring. And you see this kind of reflected in practice, and people ask good questions. I'm constantly fascinated and listening. I'm always listening into other people's ideas and other people's the questions they're pushing out there about the human experience of products and services, and you've got to treat things in a way that you understand the impact of what you do. So for instance, with games accessibility, we started out at the BBC for children, and I think the BBC was the first ever games publisher to have accessibility guidelines. But the way that we looked at it, because we were doing with children's games online, is the way it was positioned was around social currency and exclusion. It was about inclusive gaming rather than building games and building accessible games. And there was a cracking guy I met there from the early days called Ian Hamilton, who you probably know is kind of like one of the gods of games accessibility. And we worked together on the first set of guidelines. And the way that we positioned it was, children were being integrated into mainstream more and more and more. And games are a social currency to children. And if they can't all join in the same game, they then can't join in the conversation around it. And then they're excluded. We end up designing in social exclusion by not making children's games inclusive. You sort of sit that it's not about the impact necessarily on the individual. It then becomes the social impact on the group, and you turn someone in a small way into an outsider within a conversation. And that's just not acceptable, in any way, means or forms. You don't exclude children. And so I find that more and more of the conversations seem to be going, which is brilliant, is going beyond, sort of thinking about the individual's user experience and thinking about the impact. As the web is growing, it's a destination for entertainment and for interaction, and it's a big part of our lives. And we need to evolve sort of out of the purely functional perspective of accessibility. There's a lot to be said for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. But then you also need to have enjoyable and appropriate, and and all those other things that come in. You need to balance, the functional with the emotional, and the cultural accessibility is a really important thing, because I think these days, the way that things are going, particularly on sort of entertainment and collaborative platforms and all sorts of stuff like that, if you don't get the emotional right, it doesn't matter how functionally accessible you make something, they're not coming back because they didn't enjoy it. They didn't feel like they could contribute, they didn't feel like they were involved, they didn't feel like they were reflected within it. And so I think the accessibility is, and you're starting to see it in the new legislation which is being discussed. Words like enjoy are finding their way into this because they're so important. I don't think you'll ever enjoy a tax return, but if there's still an emotional thing that you shouldn't be more stressed than everyone else because you can't access it and you're worried did I do it correctly? Did I not? Because of the way the form was built. There's still emotional attachments, and there's emotional attachments to brands, and this is that whole thing is this becomes the brand experience to things should work in whatever modality and whatever way that you want to engage with that. whether it's an audio only experience, a visual only experience, whether it's an experience that's tactile, whether it's an experience that's multisensory, doesn't matter. The brand experience still needs to be all pervasive into whatever mode it is, and it needs to be equivalent emotionally. And that's the bit that fascinates me, the way that we're starting to wake up to this.
Just kind of looking forward, last question I had for you is just if there are any particular activities you're looking forward to yourself, any new technologies or skills that you still want to learn about. What do the next 6 months or a year look like for you?
I've got so many hobbies. The great thing I think about accessibility, and I think if you're a proper accessibility nerd, is if all of your hobbies are pretty much accessibility as well. And I do so many extra projects and bits and pieces out. If anyone who knows me, font accessibility is one of the areas that I'm fascinated by, because fonts are so complicated. This whole redactive thing of serif versus sans serif and all the rest of it, which doesn't bear witness to, there's nothing, no evidence that actually works, because fonts are a part of, there's so many different aspects to them, and so many different things that impact on readability and legibility. And I've been nerding out in that space since like sort of about 2009. And there are other people who know a lot more about it than me. I'm a good friend of mine, Bruno Marg. I always turn around. He's got 30 odd years on me in this area, in the neuroscience of reading. And I find that massively fascinating, because we're so often dealing with reading experiences. And yet it's such a foundation of accessibility, and yet it's an area of unknown. Or at least, there's so much exploration to be had. So I'm finding that fascinating. I'm absolutely loving what's happening in the games industry, and the games industry has accelerated accessibility beyond anything else in any of the digital or non-digital industry. They've gone from zero to incredible. It feels like overnight. And I'm constantly learning from, organizations from as diverse from, sort of obviously the Xbox side of stuff through to, the PlayStation guys, through the big platform stuff and what they're doing, which is all brilliant, to the Ubisofts and the Square Enixes, etc., and what they're doing, and Sega, etc., how they're engaging and the ideas they're coming up with, because you're dealing with far more complicated things. And I was doing some work with Miro a while back, and they were really struggling with their approach. And and they're a big almost like an open world game collaborative platform. They're not a website. You can't apply web guidelines to something that isn't a website and doesn't behave like a website. And so we immediately started looking to the games industry and saying, how are they dealing with this? There are more and more sort of accessibility happening in open world games and platforms. So how can we bring this into working collaboration? How do we transpose those ideas into a working place? Because it's a similar idea, it's a similar space. So there's all these different aspects, but the one that fascinates me the most out of the areas, and it's sort of the biggest project that I've been working on with a whole group of other people, is data. And we have to get better at understanding the impact of what we do. I'm a massive believer in accessibility benefits everyone, but I'm really, really, really dying to find ways of proving it and bringing that to life, because I think once people realize the benefits of inclusion, beyond not thinking about it as worthiness and not thinking about it as benevolent, which kind of makes it struggle a bit, but bringing it into the perspective of worthwhile, and understanding it's worthwhile for all of us to do, because it enriches all sorts of things, from services to organizational culture to society. And it opens up opportunity for organizations. It's in so many ways around reach and engagement, and we can talk about not just sort of medical impairment, but we start talking about situational impairment and environmental impairment, and start really opening up the social model within design. It suddenly becomes much more fascinating. But data, I think, is the key to this, and that's the thing that we need to get a lot smarter at. to be able to, tell the story of accessibility.
Well, you've given some three great categories of things for us to think about, and the one with fonts is definitely one I hadn't thought about. But it's been a pleasure to chat with you, Gareth. I
Thank
appreciate you
you.
taking the time to talk with me today.
Oh, it's absolute pleasure. It's my favorite subject, and I will talk all day to anyone about it. I think it's a fascinating area, and it's all just about people, and what a better thing to be interested in.
All right, well, thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank you so much.